How do we have good relationships with other people? The Bible tells us in Romans chapter 12, verse 8, it says this: "If it is possible, as far as it depends upon you, live at peace with everyone." That's the exhortation of the Word of God, that as followers of Jesus, we have to strive to live peaceably with those around us. That means your husband, your wife, your kids, your parents, brothers and sisters. That can be a tough one at times. Extended family, friends, neighbors, co-workers, and especially fellow Christians. Every relationship that you can think of. Now, when you think of those relationships, when you think of, just think of all the relationships you have in your life, when you think of them, is peaceful a word that comes to your mind to describe them? I hope so. I hope so. But the reality is that relationships, even the best of relationships, can be difficult. I know for sure if everyone did everything exactly the way I wanted them to do it, all of my relationships would be fantastic. Well, at least they'd be fantastic for me anyway. I don't know about everybody else. But that's not reality. The reality is that people in this world don't always do things the way we want to. People in this world don't always do the things that we like, and that can make having peaceful or good relationships with people challenging. So given that we're all imperfect people, given that we all have difficulties and problems, how then can we work towards, as Christians, that's what we're called to as Christians, how can we work towards peaceful or good relationships with others? And I think that our text this morning has some help for us in that regard. So if you have your Bibles, turn again, Genesis chapter 21, and we're looking at verses 22 through 34. And these verses record for us the peaceful agreement that is arrived at between Abraham and another man named Abimelech. This text gives us some valuable insights into having a peaceful or a good relationship with other people. It shows us, this is the first thing it shows us, is that in order to have peaceful relationships or good relationships with other people, we need to be honest. We need to be honest. Lies, when we're not honest with one another, when we're not honest with other people, when we lie to them, it makes a good relationship with them impossible. In these verses, the local king named Abimelech comes to make a peaceful agreement with Abraham. And we've seen Abimelech before in Genesis chapter 20. And in that chapter, in Genesis chapter 20, Abraham lies to Abimelech. You remember that? He goes and he arrives in the land and he says about his wife Sarah, he says, "She is my sister." And Abimelech thinks, well, she's his sister. That's great. She's attractive. This is a powerful man. It would be great if we were to be married, and then we'd have a friendship between me and Abraham, and that would probably increase my wealth. And so he takes her as his wife. And you'll recall that God, before Abimelech could touch Sarah, God arrives in a dream to Abimelech, and he says, "If you don't return that man's wife, you're a dead man." And God terrifies Abimelech. So the last time that we've seen Abimelech, Abraham lied to him. And so we read this in verses 22 and 23 of chapter 21. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, said to Abraham, "God is with you in everything you do. Now swear to me here before God that you will not deal falsely with me or my children or my descendants. Show to me and the country where you are living as an alien the same kindness that I have shown you." He gets He gets that God is with Abraham. He gets that God is for Abraham, and his encounter with God has been a terrifying one, and so he wisely wants to make peace with Abraham. He wisely wants to have a good relationship with Abraham. Now that's important to understand about this text, because this text is about two people who want to have a good relationship with one another. Remember the command in Romans 12:8, it says, "As far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." I've lived long enough to know that living at peace with everyone is not always possible, because not everyone is interested in having a good, peaceful relationship. Sometimes people are just not going to like you. That's just how it is. And there's a way, the Bible calls us to love our enemies. The Bible calls us to do good to those who hate us, but to those who hate us. That's another sermon entirely. This sermon, this text, is about two people who want to have a good relationship with one another. And the main thing, when Abimelech comes and he wants to have peace, he wants to have a good relationship with Abraham, the main thing is he asks for honesty. He says, "Do not deal falsely with me." In other words, be honest. Tell me the truth. That is essential for a peaceful or a good relationship. I have yet to meet a husband, a wife, a parent, a son, a daughter, a neighbor, or a friend who feels like they have a good relationship with someone who lies to them. I don't recommend you try this with your husband or wife, but I can guarantee you if you lie to them and they find out about it, your house is not going to be peaceful. I can guarantee if you lie to your friend and they find out about it, they're going to be mad at you. There's nothing peaceful about lying. In fact, you see that in chapter 20 when Abimelech finds out that he's been lied to. He's like, "Man, what did you do to me?" It's impossible to have a good relationship if there's not honesty. Lies produce mistrust and anger, not peace. Sometimes it's difficult to be truthful. I understand that. We fear getting in trouble. We fear people finding something out about us. We fear losing a relationship. We fear being hurt. And so we think in the moment that the right thing to do, the best thing to do, is to lie or to not be honest. But it's essential to understand if there's anything that we need to have a good relationship with another person, it's honesty. Several years ago, when I was still working as an electrician, I was working on this restaurant. It was a renovation of an existing restaurant. They were taking kind of a mediocre restaurant and they wanted to turn it into a real high-end restaurant, like a nice place. And so everything in the place was like the best you could get, right? Like expensive everything. And I remember I was hanging a light fixture in the bathroom, and they had this pedestal sink in the washroom that I'm sure was worth more than my paycheck. And as I was hanging the light fixture, my screwdriver slipped out of my hand. It fell in the sink and put a huge crack in the sink. Now, at that moment, I had a decision to make because there's all kinds of people in a construction project. There's 20 people on site. You could just walk out of the bathroom. Nobody saw it. You could just walk out of the bathroom and no one would ever know. How did that sink get broken? I don't know. I could have done that. But as soon as I looked down and I saw it was broken, I knew what I had to do. I had to go right to the general contractor and I had to tell him, "No, man, I feel terrible about this, but I was putting up the light fixture, I dropped my screwdriver, and the sink broke. And there's no way to fix it, and it needs to be replaced." And I was prepared to, I was ready to give up my paycheck for that. Thankfully, they didn't make me do that. They replaced it on they paid for it. But going to him, he was kind of a difficult guy to get along with. And nobody really had a good relationship with the general supervisor. But from the moment I did that, from the moment I told that man the truth, we had a fantastic relationship for the rest of the time because he knew I wouldn't lie to him. He knew I would tell him the truth, even when it was hard. That's important to have a good relationship. Trust is important to good relationships, and honesty is essential to trust. And Abimelech makes it clear here. We don't know what Abimelech's relationship to God was like, other than the fact that we know that he feared God. And we know that he knew that God was with him. And the thing that he wants from Abraham is honesty and trust. He says, don't deal falsely with me or my children or my descendants. Show to me the same kind of kindness that I've shown you. That word kindness there can also be translated as faithfulness or loyalty. You want a good relationship, you need honesty and loyalty and faithfulness. That's crucial to having good and peaceful relationships with folks. That's what Abimelech wants with Abraham, and so he says, deal honestly with me. Don't deal falsely with me. You know what? I'm convinced that Christians, and I hope you agree with this, Christians ought to be the most trustworthy people there are. I think very few things do more harm to the gospel of Jesus Christ than when a Christian acts like he's an unbeliever or like she's an unbeliever. When a Christian lies and cheats and takes advantage of people and then comes to church on Sunday and says everything's good, I'm a follower of Jesus, that does more harm to the gospel, I think, than many, many other things. Christians ought to be the most trustworthy, the most honest people there are. When people know that we're a Christian, and people should know that we're Christians, we should say that we're followers of Jesus, they should look at our lives and they should equate following Jesus with being an honest person, with being a person of integrity. They ought to equate those two things, and when they don't, we do harm to the gospel. People should be able to trust what we say. That's essential to a good relationship. So just take a moment and think about all the relationships that you have in your life, at home, at work, your friends, your acquaintances. Think about all those things. And if we were to go around and ask all the people in your life that are connected to you, do you trust me? What would they say? If you were to ask all the people in your life, do you trust me? What would they say? How are you doing with honesty in your relationship? It's essential to having a good, peaceful relationship. It's necessary. But there's more to think about when it comes to having good and peaceful relationships. And in order to have a good relationship, we need to be honest. And here's the second thing. To have a good relationship, we need to be forthright. We need to be forthright. Ignoring problems, when you ignore problems in your relationship, it always leads to future conflicts, and it always leads to future conflicts being worse. If you're going to have a good relationship with people, you need to be forthright. After Abraham agrees to deal honestly and faithfully with Abimelech, that's what he says in verse 24. In response to Abimelech's question, he says, I swear it, I promise I will deal honestly with you. And then we read this in verse 25. Then Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. Now, having a good well of water, as we've seen this morning, that's great that 122 is here this morning for this. This is perfect. Having a good well of water is important. It's important to everyone. It's especially important in the life of a shepherd. Where Abraham's located right now, where he's living about halfway between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. So getting water for all of his people, he's got several hundred people in his camp, and all of his livestock, he's got all kinds of livestock. Getting water for all the people and all the livestock would have been a challenge, especially in the drier months of the year in that area. He's hovering just above a desert region where he's camping out right now. So water would have been a challenge. And so he gets it into his mind, he takes it upon himself to dig a well. If you've ever seen a well dug today, it's awesome. Like they get these huge machines with drill bits, man, and they can drill down miles and miles and miles into the earth. When Abraham digs the well, there's none of that. You've got shovels and picks and hand tools, and he goes to the work and he puts his servants to the task of digging this well, and he digs a good well where he can have a good fresh supply of water. Well, the place where Abraham is living, he doesn't own the land. He's dug the well, but he doesn't own the land. The land is run by this king named Abimelech. And I'm sure that when Abimelech's servants came across the well, they just said to Abraham's servants who were taking care of their sheep and the people who were using the well, they said, hey, listen. This is not your well. You might have dug it, but it's not yours because it's not on your land. This belongs to Abimelech, the king in this area. Get out of here. Now, Abraham could have, at that point, he could have tried by force to keep the well. But that likely could have been interpreted as an act of war. And so rather than risk war, Abraham allows the well to be seized. While he decides that standing down, not fighting for the well, is the wise decision in this situation, the whole thing clearly is bothering him. You ever been wronged in your life? You ever had some kind of injustice served on you, especially by someone whom you love? Like, has your wife ever done something that's just made you super mad? Or your husband done something that just, or your kids, or your parents? You just get a sense from the way Abraham approaches this with Abimelech that it's bothering him. Sure, he didn't fight, he didn't go to war over a well, and that was a wise decision, but it bothers him that the well has been taken from him. It's impossible to say from the text how long ago the well was taken from him, but based on Abimelech's reaction, which he says this, Abimelech said, I don't know who has done this. You didn't tell me, and I only heard about it today. You get the impression from Abimelech, man, you didn't tell me about this, so it kind of gives you the sense that this happened a while ago, and Abraham's just been kind of camping on it. He lets the well go, but it bothers him. He just remains silent. He doesn't say anything to Abimelech. He might have even thought that the servants were acting on Abimelech's orders. In the ancient world, when a servant did something, it was just like the master had done it. And so he's clearly upset over this whole thing, but he remains silent. He never goes and sees Abimelech about the problem. Here's the thing. That approach, remaining silent about the things that are bothering us, remaining silent about the things that are upsetting us, about the things that we feel are unjust, only leads to problems. That never works out in relationships. Just think about all the relationships that you have again, husband, wife, parent, child, brother, sister, friend. How many of you would agree that the people that we love the most upset us from time to time? Now think about a time that someone close to you has ticked you off, and you've said nothing about it. You just have buried the problem. You stay silent. How did that go? How did that work out for you? Having unresolved issues in relationships is like putting pressure into a container. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago we had bought a... Maybe it was longer than that. We had bought a used bike for Olivia, and we got it home, and she was just super excited to ride it, but it needed some air in the tires. And so I proceeded to pump up the tires so that she can ride it. And anybody who's ever done any cycling knows that the harder the tire is, the faster you can ride. If you didn't know that, if you're riding around in soft tires, you need to pump those things up. So I gave it a few pumps, and then I checked it, and I'm like, I think I can get a little more in that. A few more pumps. Yeah, it's feeling pretty good, but we'll just go with 2 more pumps. On about the 3rd pump, boom! The tire exploded. That is a perfect illustration for what happens with unresolved issues in relationships. Like if somebody's done something to you that's bothering you and you don't deal with it, you're not forthright about it, you don't talk to them about what they've done, that's like putting a pump. That's like putting a pump of air into your anger container. And then somebody else does something and you don't say anything. That's another pump. And then somebody else says something that bothers you and you don't say anything. That's another pump. And then pretty soon, before you know it, you're exploding over nothing. Like somebody left a cup on a counter and you freak out about it. And it has nothing to do with the cup on the counter. It has everything to do with all those unresolved issues that you failed to deal with. Every time that we aren't forthright in our relationships, when we've got something that is bothering us and we just keep silent on it, it's just like setting a time bomb. You're just waiting for things to explode. There's no way that you can have peaceful relationships. There's no way that you can have good relationships with people if you continue to sit on things and you're not forthright about what's happening in your life or what's happened in your relationship. Getting upset about things and not saying anything about it is both damaging to relationships and it's an incredible waste of energy. I mean, Abraham's probably been upset about this well for several months. Abimelech doesn't even know about it. And I wonder how many times in our relationships when we're upset about something that somebody's done to us, they don't have a clue. I mean, I can say this as a husband. There has been many, many times in my marriage where I've been clueless about something that I've done. So who suffers then? Who gets hurt in that time? Well, if the other person doesn't know about it, they're certainly not thinking about it. And you're the one that suffers. Here's the reason why we need to be forthright in our relationships is because people can't read our minds. I mean, if you could read my mind, it would probably be scary and you wouldn't want to be around me very much. So I'm thankful that you can't read my mind. And let's never assume that people can read our minds. If we spend our whole time thinking, well, they should have known. They should have done something different. How could they not know? It's just a waste of time and energy. People cannot read our minds. After a while, we start to give nonverbal cues like the big sighs or the grumpy opening of cupboards and doors and slamming of doors. And then people say, "What's wrong with you?" "Nothing." Or they ask, "Hey, are you angry with me?" "No." That's not a good, peaceful relationship. And it's never going to, acting like that and behaving like that is never, ever going to resolve your problems. It's never, ever going to give you a good relationship with other people. The only way forward is to be forthright and say, you know what? What you did the other day made me mad. Now let's talk about it and work it out. That's the way forward. That's the way to have good, peaceful relationships. It takes courage to do that, and it takes grace on both sides. It takes courage to be forthright with someone, and it also takes grace to receive what that person has to say. We have to be honest and forthright with one another if we're going to have good relationships, but we also need humility to listen concerning how we may have been wrong in the situation, concerning how we might need to demonstrate integrity in the situation in order to make things right. Honesty and forthrightness are important to relationships, and then Abraham gives us another aspect to good relationships in 27 through 31. Here he shows us that having good relationships with people requires us to be invested. Every meaningful relationship that we have requires us to give of ourselves. If we're going to have good relationships with people, we need to be invested. Listen to 27 through 31. So Abraham brought sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a treaty. Abraham set apart 7 ewe lambs from the flock, and Abimelech asked Abraham, "What is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs you have set apart by themselves?" He replied, "Accept these 7 lambs from my hand as a witness that I dug this well." So that place was called Beersheba, because the 2 men swore an oath there. If we approach relationships with a "what can I get out of this" attitude, if we approach relationships expecting the other person to meet our needs, we're going to have a hard time having good relationships with people. There's 2 things that are going on in these verses 27 through 31. First, Abraham is giving Abimelech some livestock as a symbol of the promise he made in verse 24. When Abimelech said, "Deal honestly with me," Abraham says, "I swear it," that is, I promise, I will. And they make this treaty. It could also be translated, the word there can also be translated covenant with one another. And Abraham gives him some livestock to seal that covenant, to say, I'm in this relationship with you. So Abraham promises to deal honestly and faithfully with Abimelech. And the livestock is a way of saying, I'm committed to living peacefully with you. I'm committed to having a good relationship with you. Children teach us this. They do this almost instinctively. You ever see 2 kids on a playground become friends? Or in a schoolyard that become friends? They often will give each other stuff, right? Like, "Here, you take my toy," or "you take my lunch," or whatever. They'll give each other stuff. And why do they do that? Why do kids give each other stuff? Because it's a symbol of saying, "Hey, I'm your friend, and you're my friend, and whenever you look at this toy, you'll think of me." We do this with husbands and wives, right? Like, we exchange rings as symbols to say that we're invested. We hand down heirlooms, family heirlooms, to our children so that when our children look at the things that we've passed on to them, they remember our relationship. It's like you're saying as a parent, "Hey, I'm invested in you. I love you. When you look at this, think of me." It has everything to do with relationship. That's why we exchange these things. It seems pretty obvious that we do these things as a way of showing that we are committed to our relationships. It's a tangible way of showing that we're invested in being a good friend. And Abraham shows that he's invested by giving Abimelech some livestock. The second thing that's going on in this text is he is showing Abimelech that he is a person of integrity. That's what's going on with the 7 ewe lambs there. Abraham gives Abimelech the 7 lambs. He set apart 7 special lambs as a witness, it says, that he dug the well, as a witness that I am doing what I'm saying I'm going to do, right? Deal honestly with me. Tell me the truth. And Abraham's saying, look, these 7 lambs are a representation that I'm going to do that with you, that I am being honest with you. It's an investment in saying that I'm dealing with you in integrity. The number 7 there is particularly important in the Bible and in the book of Genesis. It has to do, and all through the Bible, you can trace it back to Genesis 1 and 2 in the creation week, right? In 6 days, God created the world, and then on the 7th day, He did what? He rested. And what He did is He looked back and he saw all that He had made, and He said that it was very good. So the 7th day, God does no work, He does no creative action on the 7th day, and He celebrates it. So the number 7 biblically is a number of completeness or fullness. So Abraham is saying, by giving 7 ewe lambs here, he's saying that I am giving you these things to show the fullness or the completeness of my integrity. And by receiving the gift, Abimelech is saying, I recognize the fullness and the completeness of your integrity. The well is yours. And so they call that place Beersheba, which means, jot this down, it means well of 7. That's literally what Beersheba means. And so Abraham shows that he's invested in his relationship. He swears to make this covenant with Abimelech, and he shows his integrity in these two gifts. He's invested in the relationship. It costs him something. That's exactly what Abimelech was looking for from Abraham, that he would be a person of honesty and integrity. He wants to have a peaceful and good relationship with Abraham based on honesty. And Abraham saying, by giving him this livestock and these 7 lambs, he's saying, I'm all in on this. I'm invested in this. He uses more than words. He uses words. He says, I swear it, I promise, but he uses more than words to show his commitment. He also uses actions as well. That is a powerful ingredient in good relationships. When people know that we're committed, when people know that we're committed beyond words, the words that we say, when they can see it by the things that we do, it is a clear message that we're committed to that relationship with the other person. It means that if we're invested in a relationship, it means that if and when that relationship is broken, we experience loss. It's going to be to our detriment that we lose that relationship with someone else. That's what it means to be invested. It means that if I lose this relationship, it's going to hurt me. It's going to be a loss to me. If we can walk away from a friendship or any kind of relationship with an oh well type attitude, like, I am not sorry to see that person go. You ask yourself, is that a good relationship or a bad relationship? Like if the person walks out on you, if they don't want to be your friend anymore or whatever, if that relationship's broken, you're like, good. Is that a good relationship? I don't see how anybody could think that was a good relationship. If we're going to have good relationships, we need to be invested. We need relationships to cost us something. That if we lose that relationship, it's a loss to us. Keeping relationships is hard. In order to do it, we need to be honest, we need to be forthright, and we need to be invested. But there's a huge problem with doing all of those things. And here it is. We fail at all of that. We tend, as human beings who are fallen into sin, we tend to skirt the truth from time to time. We tend to lack the courage to be forthright. Or we're forthright in the wrong way. We're forthright not in a loving way, not in wanting to preserve a relationship, but in a way to beat people down. And we tend to be more concerned with ourselves than with others. I'm convinced that our biggest problem in most of our relationships, our biggest problem, the biggest obstacle to having peaceful and good relationships is us. I'm my biggest problem. If things aren't going well in my marriage, I'm my biggest problem in that regard. If things aren't going well with a friend or a coworker, I'm my biggest problem in that regard, almost always. That is why we need to see the last thing in this text that is so important to having good relationships. This is what gives us the ability to do the things that are necessary to maintain a good relationship. Abraham shows us in the last couple of verses here that we need to be rooted in Christ. The only thing that will allow us to be selfless enough to maintain good relationships with others is to have our deepest relational needs met in the Lord Jesus Christ. We need to be rooted in Christ. Abraham's covenant with Abimelech wraps up, and we read this in verses 32 through 34. After the treaty had been made at Beersheba, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called upon the name of the Lord, the eternal God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines for a long time. This situation is filled with all kinds of possibility for conflict. It's filled with all kinds of possibility for a ruined relationship. Why in the world does Abimelech bring Phicol along anyway? He's the commander of his army. He's the commander of his forces. It's the symbol of his might. You only bring the commander of your army if you're prepared for a battle. So this situation is all kinds of potential for conflict, all kinds of potential for fighting. But as I said in the beginning, that's not what Abimelech wants. He wants a peaceful relationship, and that's exactly what he gets. The treaty's made, and then he returns home. In other words, they have a peaceful relationship. Abraham's well has been returned to him, and he has every reason to be optimistic about the future of his relationship with Abimelech.